The Sunday sun was high over Oakwood Park, casting long golden shadows across the grass where Elias Thorne stood with his 7-year-old son, Leo. They were playing catch, a simple, rhythmic ritual of fatherhood. Elias, wearing a crisp, dark tracksuit, moved with the measured grace of a man used to controlling a room. Leo, with his pale skin and shock of bright red hair, was the image of his late mother. A contrast that Elias had long ceased to notice, but one the rest of the world often stumbled over. The rhythm broke when a patrol car rolled over the curb, its tires crunching onto the grass. Officer Miller stepped out, his hand resting instinctively on his belt. He didn't see a father and son. He saw a demographic mismatch that triggered a practiced suspicion. "All right, buddy, stand up and step away from the boy," Miller commanded. The subversion hook was set the moment the first metal cuff snapped. To the casual observer and to the officer, this was a routine stop of a suspicious man. But beneath the surface, a ticking time bomb had been activated. Elias Thorne wasn't just a man in a park. He was a senior federal prosecutor for the Southern District, a man who spent his days dismantling the very types of procedural misconduct Miller was currently committing. "Officer, is there a problem?" Elias's voice was terrifyingly calm. It wasn't the voice of a man afraid of the police. It was the voice of a man documenting a crime. "We got a call. Suspicious male loitering with a minor," Miller snapped, pushing Elias toward the grass. "I need proof of guardianship. Now." Leo began to sob, the baseball dropping from his small hand and rolling toward the officer's boot. The contrast was sharp. The terrified, red-headed child and the stoic black man being forced into the dirt. Nearby, joggers stopped. A tourist's camera zoomed in. The digital record was already beginning. "My ID is in my wallet on that bench. 3 feet to your left," Elias said, his cheek pressed against the cool grass. Miller didn't look. He was caught in the momentum of his own bias. "You'll explain it at the station." "Subject is non-compliant," he barked into his radio, calling for a 1071. Child abduction. The tension reached a breaking point as backup sirens wailed in the distance. This is the heart of the subversion. The audience knows something the antagonist doesn't. They are watching a man destroy his own life in real time, thinking he is the hero of the story. When the backup arrived, an older officer named Sergeant Vance stepped out. He approached the bench to secure the suspect's belongings. He flipped open the leather wallet. His movements stopped, his face drained of color. Vance didn't look at Elias. He looked at Miller with pure, unadulterated dread. Inside the wallet sat a gold-etched badge and a Department of Justice ID. "Miller," Vance whispered, his voice cracking. "Drop the keys. Now, I've got a kidnapping lead, Sarge. Shh. Unlock him. Do you have any idea who this is?" The subversion was complete. The victim stood up, not to flee, but to take command. Elias didn't rub his wrists. He adjusted his sleeves and looked Miller in the eye with the cold precision of a judge. "You ignored a child's testimony, ignored available documentation, and broadcast a baseless abduction code," Elias said. The park was silent. "I'm not going to the station, Officer Miller, but by tomorrow morning, you will be." The 1071 wasn't a kidnapping. It was the sound of a $2 million settlement and the end of a career. Elias picked up his son and the baseball, leaving the officers standing in the middle of a park that was now a crime scene of civil rights. The hook had been pulled, and the truth had landed with the weight of a gavel. The sun hung low over the manicured grass of Oakwood Park, casting long, dramatic shadows that seemed to pull the tension right out of the earth. Elias Thorne stood centered in a patch of light, his dark skin glowing against the pristine white of his athletic gear. Across from him, his 7-year-old son, Leo, was a vibrant contrast. Leo's skin was pale, dusted with a constellation of copper freckles, and his hair was a shock of defiant flame-red curls that caught the light like a signal fire. They were playing catch. The rhythmic thwack of the ball hitting the leather mitt was the only sound in their private world. "Good eye, Leo," Elias called out, his voice a deep, resonant rumble of pride. The rhythm was shattered by the gravelly crunch of tires. A patrol car didn't just pull up, it invaded the space, stopping abruptly on the grass. Officer Miller stepped out, his boots heavy and rhythmic, a mechanical sound that silenced the birds. He didn't look at the smiles or the shared sweat of a workout. He looked at the man, then the boy, then back at the man. To Miller, the visual math didn't add up. The contrast wasn't beautiful, it was suspicious. "All right, buddy. Stand up and step away from the boy," Miller commanded. His hand hovering over his holster with practiced aggression, Elias stopped. The air in the park suddenly felt heavy, like the moments before a thunderstorm. "Officer, is there a problem?" "We're just finishing up. I'll ask the questions. I need to see some ID and proof that this child belongs to you," Miller snapped. He moved closer, his shadow falling over Leo. Leo froze. The boy's bright red hair seemed to pale as the blood drained from his face. He looked at his father, then at the silver badge on the officer's chest. The baseball, slick with the sweat of their game, slipped from Leo's trembling fingers. The ball hit the grass with a dull thud and began to roll. It was a slow, agonizing crawl across the green. It rolled past Elias's expensive sneakers and kept going until it bumped softly against the polished black tip of Officer Miller's combat boot. The bright white sphere sat there, a symbol of stolen innocence resting against the machinery of state power. "Keep your hands where I can see them, on the ground, now!" Miller barked, misinterpreting Elias's shift toward his son as a threat. Elias knelt. He didn't fight. He knew the choreography of this tragedy all too well. As his knees hit the dirt, he kept his eyes locked on Leo. "Leo, look at me. Just look at me, okay? It's going to be fine." Subject is non-compliant. Requesting backup for a possible 1071. Miller into his radio. The 1071 code, child abduction, echoed through the park. It was a verbal brand. Miller hadn't checked the SUV parked nearby. He hadn't checked the open wallet sitting on the park bench just 10 feet away, which displayed Elias's credentials as a senior federal prosecutor. He only saw the visual anchor of the red-haired boy and the black man, and he let his bias write the rest of the script. By the time the backup sirens began to scream in the distance, a dozen cell phones were raised in the crowd. The viewers at home wouldn't need a narrator to explain the injustice. They would see the father in the dirt, the trembling boy with the flame-red hair, and that lone baseball resting against the officer's boot. A silent witness to a $2 million mistake that was just beginning to unfold. The atmosphere in Oakwood Park didn't explode, it curdled. While the first officer, Miller, continued to bark orders, his voice cracking with a misplaced sense of authority, a heavy, suffocating silence began to swallow the space around them. This was the silent climax, the moment where the noise of the world fades away, and the weight of an irreversible mistake settles into the bones. Elias Thorne remained on his knees. He didn't scream about his rights. He didn't mention his salary or his status. He simply watched his son, Leo, whose red curls were damp with sweat and tears. The handcuffs were tight, the metal biting into Elias's wrists, but he didn't flinch. He was the calmest person in the park, and that calm was the most terrifying thing about him. The sirens of the backup units cut out abruptly, leaving only the hum of the city in the distance. Sergeant Vance, a man with 20 years on the force and graying hair that spoke of 1,000 process scenes, stepped out of the lead cruiser. He didn't rush in with his weapon drawn. He scanned. He saw the crowd with their phones up. He saw the crying boy. And then he saw the bench. Miller was still talking. "Sarge, I caught him trying to move the kid toward the SUV. No ID, no cooperation. I'm thinking 1071, possibly domestic." Vance didn't respond to Miller. He walked, slow and deliberate, toward the park bench where Elias's leather wallet lay open. The camera of a bystander followed Vance's eyes. The sergeant reached down, his gloved hand trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the sudden, sharp realization of a career-ending disaster. He flipped the wallet fully open. The silent climax hit its peak. Vance didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply stopped breathing for a beat. His eyes locked onto the gold-etched badge of a senior federal prosecutor. He saw the name Elias Thorne. He saw the federal seal that carried more weight than every badge in that park combined. Vance looked up from the wallet to Elias. For 3 seconds, they held eye contact. In those 3 seconds, a silent conversation happened. Vance's eyes pleaded for a misunderstanding. Elias's eyes offered only the cold, hard reality of the law. Vance turned his head toward Miller. Miller was still basking in his perceived victory, adjusting his belt, looking at the crowd as if he had just saved a life. "Miller," Vance said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, hollow ghost of a sound. "Yes, Sarge? You want me to prep the transport?" "Drop the keys," Vance whispered. "What?" "Drop the keys." Now, the confusion on Miller's face was the masterpiece of the scene. The audience watches the antagonist's world crumble before he even understands why. Miller looked at the wallet in Vance's hand. He looked at the federal ID. Then, he looked at his own handcuffs on the wrists of a man who could dismantle his entire department with a single phone call. The sound of the keys hitting the pavement was the loudest noise in the park. It was the sound of a $2 million liability hitting the city's ledger. There was no shouting match, no dramatic brawl, just the sight of a veteran officer's face turning a sickly shade of gray as he realized that the suspicious male he had just forced into the dirt was now the most powerful man in the room. The silence wasn't just gold. It was the sound of justice preparing to strike. The air in Oakwood Park was thick with the digital hum of a dozen lenses. In the modern age, a crime doesn't just happen in a physical space. It happens in the cloud, mirrored across 1,000 screens before the first siren even fades. As Elias Thorne was forced to his knees, he didn't just see the grass or the officer's boots. He saw the social proof rising all around him. 12 phones, 12 different angles, 12 witnesses who weren't just watching, they were broadcasting. "Don't move, Elias! We're recording everything," a woman from a nearby picnic table shouted. She held her phone with 2 hands, her knuckles white, her screen glowing with the interface of a live stream. To her left, a teenager on a skateboard had his device tilted horizontally, capturing the high-definition details of the handcuffs biting into Elias's skin. This was the new accountability. In the past, it would have been Elias's word against Officer Miller's. But in this digital theater, the narrative was being written in real time by the crowd. Miller, fueled by a dangerous mix of adrenaline and bias, seemed oblivious to the digital jury. "Back up, all of you. This is a police matter," he barked. But the crowd didn't back up. They stepped forward, guided by the invisible shield of the record button. They knew that in the USA, the camera is the ultimate equalizer. By the time Sergeant Vance walked over to the park bench and discovered Elias's federal credentials, the first video had already hit 100,000 views. By the time the handcuffs were unlocked, the story was trending on X and TikTok. The social proof was undeniable. The viewers weren't just seeing a suspicious male. They were seeing a senior federal prosecutor, a father, and a victim of systemic profiling. The true weight of accountability hit when the 4 million views mark was smashed before the sun had even set. The digital footprint was too large to ignore. The police department's public relations office, which usually took weeks to respond to complaints, was forced to issue a statement within 4 hours. The footage is clear, a news anchor said that night, the viral video playing in a loop behind her. We see the father playing catch. We see the child's distress. And we see the total lack of verification by the officer on the scene. The accountability wasn't just about the viral moment. It was about the data. Because of the 12 different recordings, investigators didn't have to rely on a single body cam that might malfunction. They had a 360-degree view of the injustice. They could see the moment the baseball hit Miller's boot. They could hear the exact second Leo's voice broke. 1 week later, the social proof turned into a legal tidal wave. The 4 million views had grown to 15 million. People from across the country were calling the mayor's office. The digital age had turned a local park incident into a national referendum on civil rights. Elias Thorne sat in his office, his phone still buzzing with notifications. He watched the video one last time, the one recorded by the tourist. He saw himself on the ground, and then he saw the reflections of the phones in the crowd. Those glowing screens were the modern-day scales of justice. Without them, his $2.1 million settlement and the department's new policy would have been a dream. With them, they were an inevitability. The cameras didn't just capture the story. They ensured that the ending couldn't be rewritten. The true measure of a victory isn't found in the thickness of a check, but in the silence of a park that has finally learned to be peaceful. For Elias Thorne, the $2. 1 million settlement was a footnote, a necessary penalty paid by a city that had failed its duty. But the legacy was something far more durable. 6 months after the incident that shook the nation, the headlines had faded and the news vans had moved on to the next tragedy. But inside the police precinct, the change was structural. The settlement hadn't just moved money, it had moved mountains. A new protocol, now known across the state as the Thorne Verification Act, was etched into the department's standard operating procedures. No welfare check could be escalated to a detention without a secondary supervisor's digital sign-off on the documentation provided at the scene. Body cams were now linked to a third-party transparency board. The legacy was the safety of every father who looked like Elias, ensuring their Sunday afternoon wouldn't be stolen by a snap judgment. The $2.1 million was partitioned with surgical precision. A significant portion founded the Leo Thorne Advocacy Center, a legal clinic dedicated to providing pro bono representation for families subjected to unlawful stops. Another portion was placed in a trust that provided mental health resources for children who had experienced trauma during police interactions. Elias didn't want the money to change his life. He wanted it to change the lives of those who didn't have a federal badge to protect them. But the real conclusion, the full circle moment, happened on a crisp Saturday morning in October. Elias pulled his SUV into the same gravel lot at Oakwood Park. For a moment, his hand lingered on the steering wheel. The memory of the cold grass against his cheek and the glint of Officer Miller's badge flashed through his mind. He looked over at Leo. The boy was older now, his flame-red hair a bit longer, clutching the same worn-out baseball they had used that day. "Ready, Leo?" Elias asked. "Ready, Dad." They walked to the exact same patch of grass. The park was busy, just as it had been before. People were jogging. Children were laughing. As Elias tossed the ball, he noticed something different. A patrol car rolled slowly by the curb, a routine patrol. But this time, the officer didn't stop. He didn't stare. He gave a respectful nod to the citizens in the park and kept moving. The legacy was visible in that simple, unremarkable moment of professional conduct. The ball popped into Leo's mitt. Thwack, the sound was no longer a trigger for trauma. It was the heartbeat of a restored life. Elias watched his son run for a fly ball, the boys' laughter echoing across the green. They weren't there as victims of a viral video or plaintiffs in a federal suit. They were just a father and a son, reclaiming their right to exist in the sun. This is why we tell these stories. Not just to witness the fall of those who abuse their power, but to see the rise of those who use that power to build a better system. Justice isn't just about the gavel coming down. It's about the peace that follows. If you believe that every family deserves a Sunday without fear, and that true justice means changing the rules so no one else has to suffer, you're in the right place. Subscribe to stay informed on the cases that are reshaping our world, one victory at a time. This is Justice Served, where the story doesn't end when the check is signed, but when the park is finally safe for everyone.